So I'm not happy with the way my video lecture on God concluded. I argued that religion belongs to the psychotic as opposed to the non-psychotic area of the mind, to the part of the mind that Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid, as distinct from the depressive or reparative position. But in so arguing, I was following Benjamin Barthélemy's definition of religion as essentially involving the supernatural, a supernatural God or gods, or at least supernatural forces, spirit entities, magical thinking. And if one does define religion that way, then certainly it does belong to the psychotic area, to the paranoid schizoid area of the mind. But not everyone defines religion in that way. I confess that I'm sympathetic to Barthélemy's definition, but there are people who define religion more broadly. Followers of, say, Paul Tillich see religion as one's ultimate concern, and if one's ultimate concern is love or truth or justice, then they consider these commitments religious. I find this questionable because there are all kinds of folks who think of themselves as atheist humanists who are also committed to love and truth and justice, and feel that there's nothing supernatural or magical at all about those commitments, and therefore are disinclined to consider them religious commitments. I tend to be with those with that way of thinking. But in any case, I did go on to argue that even if one does regard religion as belonging to the psychotic area, all of us have a psychotic area. It is all too human to be psychotic. It is all too human to be religious. We all fluctuate between PS and D. A lot of good things belong in PS, like the experience of falling in love. Who would want a life without it? On the other hand, we do have to advance to D and start seeing things rationally and realistically. There has to be the enhanced reality testing that's involved with the move into D. So I don't mean to disparage PS and everything that's in it, including religion, because there are a lot of other passions that belong to PS, political passions. I pointed out that we wouldn't have been able to defeat Hitler if we had resided entirely in the depressive position. In order to pull the trigger, we need to, at least temporarily, be operating in PS, and sometimes it's necessary to pull the trigger, to kill the predator. So there are good things in PS, there are needed things in PS. Religion belongs in PS. We can make a case, therefore, that there's a need for religion. And I think I've acknowledged that when I get the diagnosis, my need for religion, for magic, for the supernatural may well rise up, and I may be back in church lighting candles. Okay, enough with God. The topic tonight that I want to speak about is the related topic of spirituality. Now, I confess I've always had a problem with this term. It's always seemed highly ambiguous to me. What do people actually mean by it? And I think I indicated in an earlier video that if I'm going to get into magical thinking, rather than going towards pyramids and crystals, I'm going to go whole hog Roman Catholic. That attitude is shared in a quotation I want to read from the David Hare play Skylight, which was put on here in Toronto a few years ago. On my website there's an audio interview and a transcript of that interview by a journalist who interviewed me about the play. I really found the play both meaningful and enjoyable and valuable. But the quotation I want to read you is from the central character Tom, who is this crusty, narcissistic, bombastic London entrepreneur. And here's what he has to say about spirituality. This is from the David Hare play Skylight. He says, well, you know Alice. She got hold of this bloody word spiritual. It's one of those words I've never quite understood. I mean, I've always hated the way people use it. They use it to try to bump themselves up. Oh, I've had a spiritual experience, they say. As if that's the end of the argument. Spiritual, meaning it's mine and shove off. People use it to prove they're sensitive. They want it to dignify quite ordinary things. Religion, now that's something different. I like religion because religion has rules. And what's more, what makes it worth following, not that I do, mind you, what makes it worth following, there's some expectation of how you're meant to behave. But spiritual, well, it's all wishy-washy. It means, well, for me, this is terribly important. But I'm fucked if I can really say why. Unquote. Okay. Tom in David Hare's play Skylight, pointing to what he sees as the self-indulgent narcissism that, to his mind at least, and I guess I kind of agree to some degree, is often found in people who use this term spirituality. Well, a century earlier, the great G.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, says something somewhat along the same lines. So here's a quote from Chesterton. Of all conceivable forms of enlightenment, the worst is what these people call the inner light. Of all horrible religions, the most horrible is the worship of the God within. Anyone who knows anybody knows how it would work. Anyone who knows anyone from the higher thought center knows how it does work. That Jones shall worship the God within turns out ultimately to mean that Jones shall worship Jones. Let Jones worship the sun or moon, anything other than the inner light. Let Jones worship cats or crocodiles if he can find any in his street, but not the God within. Christianity came into the world, firstly, in order to assert with violence that a man had not only to look inwards, but to look outwards, to behold with astonishment and enthusiasm a divine company and a divine captain. The only fun of being a Christian was that a man was not left alone with the inner light, but definitely recognized an outer light, fair as the sun, clear as the moon, terrible as an army with banners, unquote. Okay, again, we see the connection of spirituality with narcissism, with the worship of the self, with what from a Judeo-Christian Islamic perspective would be seen as a form of idolatry, the idolatrous worship of the idolized self. So, I think we see this in a good deal of the talk about so-called spirituality. Now, in order to be fair, perhaps there's another side to this issue. Perhaps not everyone who uses the word spirituality means self-worship, ultimately. Maybe some people use the term spirituality to indicate that they're very committed and hold sacred values such as love, truth, justice. I myself am a critic of the idea that religion holds a monopoly on the sacred. One of the things I learned from Eli Sagan was that there is such a thing as the secular sacred. Why should we let religion get away with monopolizing the sacred? All kinds of non-religious folks hold things sacred, the life of a child, etc. So perhaps by spiritual, people mean, well, I'm not religious, I don't attend church, I don't subscribe to one of the official religions, but I feel quite passionately devoted to certain values, and that's why I call myself spiritual. I wish they would just call themselves ethical. But perhaps that's what they mean by spiritual. Okay. Perhaps by spiritual they mean that they're involved in a certain kind of perhaps meditative practice. Perhaps they're involved with mindfulness meditation. Perhaps with a lot of Eastern thought, Hindu, yogic, Buddhist thought, they recognize the fact that it is very difficult for a human being to be here now, to live in the present moment, that we have minds that drag us out of the present into preoccupations with the past, into anticipations of the future, that we're caught in repetitions of the past and worries about the future, and that our minds chatter away, and that we suffer anxiety regarding the stories that pervade our minds, probably most of which are not true stories or contain often very little truth whatsoever, that these stories that pervade our minds are made up of what Freud would call illusions and delusions, and that we spend our lives with being preoccupied with all of this chatter, and perhaps following these Eastern traditions, they want to engage in practices that have the effect of quietening the chatter, calming their minds. I think a lot of these practices of mindfulness and meditation bear strong parallels with psychoanalysis. I'm sympathetic to the argument that we needn't write books linking psychoanalysis to these traditions of meditation. We don't need such books because psychoanalysis is meditation. After all, Freud defined the goal of analysis as helping the patient to develop an observing ego. The analyst should be in a state of freely hovering attention. The patient should be in a state of free association. And what are we doing? We're watching the associations. And we're acquainting ourselves with the stories, the fantasies that pervade the patient's mind. Developing an observing ego, this is the same thing as the attempt to develop an inner watcher who, well, the great German writer Thomas Mann said, "A man is never the same once he has seen himself." A man is never the same once he sees himself. So psychoanalysis as a practice is helping the patient come to see himself. When we see ourselves, we're changed because there's now a gap between the self that is seen and the self that is seeing it. There's a gap introduced between the observer and the observed, between the I subject and the me as an object of my knowledge, my self-knowledge. The watcher, the inner watcher, is the I subject, who comes increasingly in psychoanalysis, as in various forms of meditation. He comes to disidentify with the selves that are watched, with the chatter that's going on, with the stories that he has hitherto identified with, but now he is coming to disidentify from, or at least to get a bit of critical distance from, to deconstruct, if you will, in the sense of no longer being captured by the stories, but observing them. Okay, this is meditation, this is psychoanalysis. Some people call all of this spiritual. They would say that a person who does this kind of thing is a spiritual person. Well, yeah, I can't really see the necessity of attaching this adjective to such meditative practice, spiritual. It's pretty well linked to that concept of a spirit, and we're back to Baithalami and his definition of religion as involving spirit entities. Spiritual. I don't know. I suppose you could make the case that that in deconstructing the stories and getting some distance from them, one is freeing oneself from the personal mind, composed of all of the images. One is moving out of the imaginary, to use Lacanian concepts, more into the symbolic. One is developing an I subject, as opposed to the specular ego, the me of the mirror phase. One is traversing the fantasy. One is gaining some distance from the me of the mirror stage, that is, from one's narcissism, one's self-preoccupation, some liberation from the stories that make up the self or selves, and one is shifting the center of balance in the personality. There's a shift from the me to the I subject. And one could argue that in emancipating the I subject in this way, one is engaging in soul making. I mean, I think it's true that through processes of this kind, one is deepening one's personality. There is a kind of enlightenment to be achieved through psychoanalysis and related forms of meditation. But I'm suspicious of these words like soul and spirit, which risk a kind of idealization of this process. I think one can wind up being a wiser person through these practices, through a good psychoanalysis. One can end up a wiser person. But I think it's part of wisdom to avoid the narcissistic seduction that is risked, I think, in the use of terms like soul and spirit for this process. I recently read The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, and the first 3/4 of the book I consider quite valuable, promoting a particular vision of how we are captured by the chatter of the personal mind, by the stories that we over-identify with, and how we are taken out of present being into stories from the past and anticipations of the future, and his use of meditation to develop an inner watcher. This all makes sense, but of course, by the last few chapters of the book, Singer goes what I consider to be in a very woo-woo direction. The I subject that is developed through the meditative process is certainly merging into Atman. It's merging into the divine. And to me, this is just more ego inflation. It's the smuggling of religion in under the guise of spirituality. And it leaves me cold, and he loses me. I then went on to read his second book, The Surrender Experiment, and I was utterly horrified by that book, which seems to me to reveal him as essentially a rather schizoid narcissist who employs meditation to accomplish, I guess, what Erich Fromm would consider to be a kind of escape from freedom. I mean, outside of Eden, we have to use our personal minds to make decisions, like decisions between good and evil. Nowhere in these books does he ever agonize over any moral question. In other words, morality seems largely absent from his thinking. It's as if struggling with the voice of conscience would be dismissed as part of the chatter of the merely personal mind, which we should somehow escape from and kind of go with the flow. And his second book is a story of how he goes with the flow all the way to being a billionaire, which I'm sure holds great appeal for a lot of people who would love to be highly spiritual and highly wealthy at the same time. And of course, there's nothing new in this. All of these yoga practicing Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or LSD dropping ex-hippies who go with the flow and create major corporations. Look, maybe some valid creativity comes out of this. Singer is WebMD. Maybe that's a good thing. But this linking of material ambition with spirituality offends me. And the notion of spiritual practices as a way of removing the agony of struggle with one's conscience. I mean, if one has a conscience, one sometimes doesn't get wealthy, sometimes one gets poor. Edward Snowden had a struggle with his conscience, and he finally blew the whistle and paid a huge price. As has Julian Assange, and as did Jesus Christ. He got crucified. So, spirituality, a concept that is often a mask for narcissism,